Hello, Internet friend. Today on Value Side, did an invisible U.S. strategy sink Syria? I'm David Ravel. Well, economic sanctions are brutal cudgels, affecting the average citizen far more than the government it's designed to topple. For instance, there is little evidence that the lifestyle of recently deposed Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad was adversely affected by the American sanctions. Yet the everyday Syrian has suffered through 11 years of civil war and their corresponding diminishing economic fortunes made all the worse by the imposition of the American economic sanctions. And that's the distinguishing characteristic of sanctions. They're invisible. Sanctions hide behind economic woes, higher prices, shortages, and a lower standard of living, all suffered by Syria since the United States instituted its most recent round of sanctions against it in 2019. Now, on December 20, 2019, President Donald Trump signed the Syrian Civilian Protection Act, an act ironically designed to protect the Syrian people from President Assad, whom the act asserted was a war criminal. Now, we know that while the Caesar sanctions were successful in removing Assad from power, its cost was borne primarily by the Syrian people, the very people the act was designed to protect. Now, Syria is one of the poorest countries in the world. In 2019, the year the Caesar Act was signed, the per capita GDP of Syrians was a mere $3,100 a year. 2 years later, under the restraints of the sanctions, per capita GDP had declined to $2,900 a year. By comparison, U.S. per capita GDP was $71,000 in 2021, 10% higher than in 2020. Unfortunately, the 2021 data is the most recent available. However, anecdotal evidence indicates that the Syrian economy continued to decline in 2022 and 2023. Now, these economic woes profoundly affected Syria's ability to defend itself. Last week, when Syria was attacked by HTS, the country looked to those very same everyday citizens in the Syrian army to defend them. However, these citizen soldiers had been suffering under the economic privation of today's Syria. Speaking on the Judge Napolitano podcast, Alistair Crook, a former British diplomat to the Middle East and a current resident in Beirut, indicated that Syrian soldiers are paid less than $10 monthly. When HTS offered the soldiers $400 to come over to their side, many took the offer. And this would explain why the entire country fell in such short order. Although we cannot confirm Crook's thesis, it describes the recent events in Syria. And that's the sinister nature of sanctions. They're nearly invisible. Many in Syria likely didn't even know what hit them. Economically, things just got worse and worse, but the why was unseen. For years, Syria has suffered because they've been restricted from imports of medicine and medical equipment. Cancer and other serious disease treatments in Syria have been substandard because the country can no longer import the pharmaceutical products used in a standard treatment. Charities have been restricted from sending much-needed aid to Syria because to do so might support a, quote, terrorist state. Syria lags far behind the rest of the world in technology because it cannot import the most recent American, European, or Asian computers, software, and other technology. And the list goes on and on. As you can imagine, the U.S. Department of State, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, and the Department of Treasury thoroughly enforce America's sanctions against Syria. The United States sanctions and prohibitions against Syria go back to 1979. However, they were dramatically increased after the civil war broke out in 2011. During that war, it's alleged that the Assad government used chemical weapons in fighting the rebels. These are the same chemical weapons that the U.S. and Israel Air Force now are relentlessly bombing. In nearly 2 days of round-the-clock missions, the U.S. Air Force and the Israeli Air Force have conducted literally hundreds of raids designed to mitigate any remaining weapons of mass destruction. Axios reports that an unnamed U.S. official said, quote, "The U.S. has a good fidelity on the status of Syria's weapon inventory, and that U.S. intelligence experts believe that it is still under control," unquote. Let's hope and pray that the weapons of mass destruction are indeed destroyed. But for what it's worth, Axios goes on to say that the rebels have indicated that they're not interested in chemical or biological weapons. However, like the entire article, the claim is made by a, quote, unknown source, who may or may not have the authority to speak for HTS or any of the other groups. Like every aspect of these battles, the objectives are not always clear, and the so-called spokespeople may not be representative. Their true motives are unknown. Over the weekend, Abu Mohammed al-Jawani, the leader of HTS, was interviewed on CNN. In the course of the interview, he indicated that he was no longer the radical jihadist of his youth, and that he had promised to protect all the people under his control, including Christians, Alawites, and Muslims. We will know in time whether this is a true vision for Syria. On the other hand, Israel indicates that its massive bombing campaign against Syrian military outposts is to eliminate those weapons of mass destruction. Again, that may indeed be their principal motive. However, it's also the case that Israel is currently destroying the military of their principal opponent to the north. Perhaps it's time for those in America to eliminate our propensity for seeing everything as black and white, good and bad. Today's Middle East is replete with dark and light grays. After all, the Syrian liberators have a background of brutal extremism, while Israel is renowned for taking advantage of any situation. But one thing we do know is that Bashar al-Assad is gone, and with him, the reason for those oppressive American economic sanctions. Let's consider lifting those Syrian sanctions, at least to allow international aid to come to the Syrian people. In 2023, after the Turkey-Syria earthquake, we waived the sanctions for 6 months. It's time to do that again. It's the least we could do. And that's today's Value Side. For all of our articles, references, and podcasts, visit valueside.com. I'm David Revell. ValueSide is independently written and researched. The views expressed are strictly my own.